Hi everyone, welcome to another pantry challenge inspired video where I'm going to be showing you some meals that I made based off of some pantry ingredients and things that we've grown and preserved. I'm going to start off with a couple of ingredients that I pulled out from my pantry, and then from there I'm going to show you 4 meals that we had this week using those ingredients. So let's get started. So here are the ingredients that I pulled out that I want to highlight this week. First off, I had a few containers of homemade barbecue sauce in my freezer, so I wanted to pull one of those out to incorporate. And then one big thing that I really wanted to start using up is a lot of my cornmeal. I know it doesn't look like I have a lot here, but I have several pounds of cornmeal downstairs from when I bought a bunch in bulk a while back, and I guess I just didn't go through it as quickly as I thought I would. So we're going to be making a few things with that, and usually with cornmeal, the two things that come to my mind are cornbread and polenta. So we're going to be making both of those things, and usually when I make cornbread I really think of like southern style meals, so we're going to have like a whole southern style meal with some braised greens. So I pulled out some of my blanched and frozen kale. We're going to be using a bunch of that, and then also usually those kinds of meals use a lot of bacon as flavoring. I don't have any bacon right now, but I do have this bacon fat that I reserved from last time I made bacon that was just sitting in the fridge. So we're going to be using this to cook a lot of the things for that meal. And then I also brought out brown or green lentils. Sometimes they're called brown, sometimes they're called green, so I don't really know, but they're just like regular brown lentils. And I just brought these out to have a little bit more protein to incorporate for the week. So yeah, these are the few ingredients that I'm going to try to use up or incorporate in meals. And then we're going to build a whole week of meals around these ingredients. For the first meal, I'm actually going to be using up some of the stuff that I cooked last week because I had made so many of these red lentil fritters and I had some leftovers. I wanted to turn them into a wrap that was inspired by falafel. So first off, I am making kind of like the flatbread that I'm going to be using for the wraps, and since these red lentil fritters are Indian inspired, I wanted to make some naan to be the flatbread wrapper for this falafel inspired sandwich wrap. So I'm just going to be using my usual naan recipe, which has water, sugar, instant yeast, and then I like to add some plain Greek yogurt to that, which adds a lot of tenderness. There's also an egg in there, and then I'm going to be adding the flour and salt. So I'm just going to give that all a quick little mix, and then I'm going to let this knead in my stand mixer for about 5 minutes. After my dough is done kneading, I use my dough scraper to scrape down the sides of the bowl and form my dough into a nice ball. I'm also going to be oiling the sides of this bowl and then covering the dough with a towel and letting that rise for 1 hour. The nice thing about flatbreads is they usually only need 1 rise rather than 2, so after a while, once this is all puffy, we're ready to shape it into our naan, and then we can go ahead and fry these instead of having to wait for them to rise another time. Normally, when I'm making this recipe and I'm just making naan to have with Indian food, I divide this into 8 balls and I kind of make them into like an oval oblong shape. But since I want these to be a wrap, I want them more circular and a little bit larger so that they'll be able to hold all of the filling I want in there. So I instead divided it into 4 so that I can have larger wraps. These did turn out to be quite enormous, so maybe 6 portions would have been better. But either way, I'm forming each of my portions into a nice ball. I'm going to spread it out with my fingers and then roll it out with a rolling pin until it's as thin as I can get it. And I like to use a little bit of oil to make sure the dough doesn't stick to the rolling pin or my cutting board. I'm going to preheat my cast iron pan to fry these off, but while that's preheating, I'm also getting my red lentil fritters heated up, and I'm just going to stick these in an oven at 350 for 8 to 10 minutes just so that they're warmed through and are slightly crispy again. And then once my pan is preheated, I'm going to fry off my naan, which needs 3 to 4 minutes on each side, and it'll puff up really nicely in the pan. Once each of those are done, I just remove it and keep it in a towel to stay warm and soft. For each of the wraps, I'm going to take a piece of naan, then I'm just going to add some sliced romaine lettuce, sliced cucumber, and then I'm going to add a few pieces of the red lentil fritters, some red onions, and then I also had this yogurt dip. I've been loving this yogurt dip lately and have been putting it on a lot of things, and I thought it would be perfect. It's just plain yogurt. I grate in 1 garlic clove and then squeeze in some lime juice. And then if I have it, I'll add in chopped cilantro. So again, this is very inspired by a falafel, so a lot of the toppings are what I would have in a falafel wrap, but I think that the pairing of the fritters with the really fresh lettuce, cucumbers, and yogurt sauce are really nice. And again, this was a super filling meal because I made my naan really big, but it was really delicious, and I think it was a really fun way to use up some of my leftover fritters from the previous week. For the next meal, I made some barbecue baked beans incorporating my homemade barbecue sauce from the freezer. And then to go along with that meal, I also made cornbread and also some braised greens. So the first thing I have is 1 pound of navy beans, which I've rinsed and soaked, and they have really plumped up very nicely. I'm going to put them in a Dutch oven, and I'm gonna cook them kind of like halfway before they go into the oven. They are gonna be baked later, but first I'm going to boil them with a bay leaf, a couple teaspoons of salt, and then one other thing I like to put in to make sure my beans soften nicely if I'm cooking them on the stovetop is just a tiny pinch of baking soda. If I'm using a pressure cooker, I don't do this because the pressure cooker tends to cook the beans really nicely and I can be sure that they're going to be soft. But sometimes on the stovetop, I find that beans don't cook all the way or they take a really long time, and the baking soda really helps to speed that up. So I'm just going to let that simmer for about an hour until the beans are starting to soften up. Then I'm going to remove them from my Dutch oven and put them aside into a bowl for now so that I can use that pot to now cook up some of my aromatics for my baked beans. So first I'm starting off with a couple of tablespoons of that bacon fat that I'm using as flavoring, and this is going to be my cooking oil. Then I'm going to add in 1 small yellow onion that I have diced up. I'll let that soften for a minute, and then I'm going to add about 3 or 4 garlic cloves that I've chopped up. And then I'm going to add in 1.5 teaspoons of smoked paprika, which is going to help give this a really nice smoky and almost like a meaty flavor. I'll let those spices bloom and fry in the oil for 30 seconds, and then I'm going to add back in my beans, and I've put them in with pretty much all of the liquid. I did reserve some, but I ended up adding it back in at the end. So if you do have extra liquid, make sure you don't pour it out in case you'll need it later. And then I'm going to add in my barbecue sauce. I have about a cup's worth of my homemade barbecue sauce. I think when I had made this, I had used my habanero hot sauce in this, so it's like a little bit of a spicy barbecue sauce, but you can really use any kind of barbecue sauce you want, whether it's homemade or store-bought. I'm gonna mix this in with the beans, and then I'm gonna add a few more things to boost up the flavor. First, I have a couple of tablespoons of molasses. Then I also added a little bit of a squeeze of yellow mustard. And then I wanted to add Worcestershire sauce, but I couldn't find where mine was, and I can't remember if I used it all up. So instead I just used soy sauce, which is gonna give a similar like savory umami note. Then I added a good splash of apple cider vinegar, and then lastly, lots of freshly cracked black pepper. Now, of course, since these are baked beans, they're going to finish cooking in the oven. So I'm gonna put the lid on my Dutch oven, and this is gonna go in a 325 Fahrenheit oven for 2 to 3 hours. Kind of depends on how long it takes your beans to soften up and how long it takes for the liquid to be absorbed or evaporate out. And when that's close to being done, I'm gonna prepare the rest of the meal. First off, I'm making some cornbread, and since I didn't have any of my pre-made cornbread mix on hand, I'm just mixing all of the dry ingredients, and I figured I would go ahead and make 2 containers that have all of the dry ingredients for my cornbread just for future meals to make my life a little bit easier. So for the dry mix, I have cornmeal, flour, baking powder, salt, and sugar. So that all goes into the containers, and then when it's time to cook, I can just add in the wet ingredients, which of course I'm gonna do right now for the cornbread I'm cooking for that night. So for the wet ingredients, I have 1 cup of milk. You can use any kind of milk. I'm using a combination of half cow's milk, half soy milk, just because that's what I had in my fridge. Then I also add in 1 egg, and then 1/3 of a cup of either butter or a neutral oil. Today I'm using sunflower oil. And those are all the ingredients, and this is a quick bread, so all you have to do is mix everything together. And then I'm going to pour this into an 8x8 glass Pyrex dish that I have buttered or oiled the sides of. So after a couple of hours, I'm checking in on my baked beans, and they were a little bit dry. They absorbed a lot of the liquid, so I added in any of the reserved bean water that I had, but it was still a little bit on the dry side, so I just added in like a half cup of water just to make sure it wasn't getting too dry, because this is going to go in the oven just a little bit longer with the lid off while we bake the cornbread. So I've cranked the oven up to 400 degrees because that's what the cornbread has to cook at for 20 minutes. And then while that's cooking, I'm just gonna stick in the beans in there with the cornbread. Then for the last part of the meal, I have another pot. I'm melting some more of my bacon fat. Then I'm going to put in half of a red onion that I've diced up. I'm putting in a generous sprinkling of crushed red pepper flakes, and also about a half teaspoon of smoked paprika, just because I've used it in the baked beans, so I wanted to bring that flavor to the greens as well. After a minute of letting those spices bloom, I'm adding in a bunch of my blanched and frozen kale. This is about 2 cups of frozen kale, but because it's already been blanched and I squeeze it together when I freeze it, it's probably the equivalent of 6 to 8 cups of fresh kale, and it's already been really condensed down in volume. Then I also added 4 to 5 cloves of garlic, as well as salt and pepper to season. I also added in a splash of water just to make sure that this wasn't too dry in the pot. You do want it to cook in a little bit of liquid. You could also use vegetable or chicken broth to cook this in. And then I also added in a few tablespoons of apple cider vinegar. So that's all the ingredients for the greens, and they just have to kind of like cook and braise in the liquid. So I'm just gonna put the lid on the pot and let that kind of simmer while everything else is finishing cooking in the oven, and then everything will be done at the same time. So I'm just putting together the final meal, slicing up our fresh cornbread, which came out super fluffy. And here's a closer look at the barbecue baked beans. These came out so well. I think this might be the first time I've ever made baked beans, and I really like the result. And I ended up with a really nice big batch of barbecue baked beans that we enjoyed all week. The navy beans are really nice. They're a really cute small size, and they're creamy and they keep their shape really well. I also served the meal with some pickles, and I just feel like everything went together really well. I felt like I was at like a nice southern restaurant with a nice assortment of different things to enjoy. So I really like how this meal came out. For the next meal, I'm going to be using up more of that cornmeal, and this time I'm going to be making a meal of polenta, and it's going to be topped with some lentils, mushrooms, and tomatoes. I'm first going to start by cooking the lentils. So in a pot I have about 2 cups of water. I'm going to lightly salt that water, and I'm cooking 1 cup of brown lentils here. I'm not going to be using all of it, but the rest I can just save for later. I figured I might as well just cook extra while I'm at it. And I'm kind of just gonna cook this as if it's pasta. Just make sure it's in plenty of water, cook it till it's tender, which will take about 15 to 20 minutes. And then afterwards, I'm going to drain off any excess water. Then I'm going to use the same pot and bring some water up to a boil. I have 6 cups of water here, and I added in a teaspoon of salt, and then I'm going to be using 1.5 cups of cornmeal to make the polenta. So it's a ratio of 1 to 4 cornmeal to water. That's a pretty good place to start at least, but later on, if it's getting too thick before your cornmeal is fully cooked, you can always add more water, which I did end up doing. So polenta does take a pretty long time to fully hydrate that corn and cook through. I'm always surprised by how long it takes. I think in total it will take between 40 to 60 minutes. Once you bring it up to a boil, just leave it at like a very low simmer. It does kind of like pop and splatter a little bit, so I like to leave it pretty low and stir it every so often so that it doesn't stick to the bottom of the pot, but it will get really nice and thick and turn into kind of like a porridge. And after about 30 minutes, I start tasting it, and if the cornmeal tastes too crunchy and too raw, then I'll add in more water so that it doesn't get too dried out before it's fully cooked. And I'll just keep doing that and testing every 5 to 10 minutes until I think the cornmeal is nice and tender. You can also cook this in broth, either vegetable or chicken broth if you prefer, but I think the most traditional way is to just cook it with water, and then you can always top it off with more things at the end to give it more flavor, for example, butter and Parmesan cheese. While the polenta is simmering away, I'm going to prep my vegetables. I have 2 large portobello mushrooms here that I'm going to slice up into small pieces. You can also just use white button mushrooms or baby bella mushrooms, but I really like the meaty texture of portobello mushrooms. I also have 4 to 5 cloves of garlic that I'm smashing and chopping up. So now in a frying pan, I have a couple tablespoons of extra virgin olive oil. I'm adding a nice generous pinch of crushed red pepper flakes. And then I'm going to add in about half of a yellow onion that I've diced. I'm gonna let that saute for a couple of minutes, and then I can add in my mushrooms. I'm adding a nice pinch of salt to season the mushrooms and also help draw out some of their moisture, and then I'm going to saute those for a few minutes until they start to shrink down in volume and have released a lot of their liquid. Once the mushrooms have started to brown and a lot of the moisture has evaporated out, I'm going to add in my chopped garlic cloves and let those cook off for a couple of minutes. Next, I'm going to add in some frozen cherry tomatoes, probably about a pint's worth. I always have frozen cherry tomatoes from the summer because they're super easy to just stick in the freezer, just washed and whole when we're drowning in cherry tomatoes in the middle of the summer. And it's really easy to incorporate them in meals like this. I can just let them cook down and they'll kind of create a little bit of a sauce. But I also had just a little bit of tomato sauce in a jar left in the fridge, so I wanted to use up the rest of that. You could probably use even more to make this more of like a tomato sauce. Maybe like a half to 1 cup of tomato sauce would have been really nice. But I was just using up the jar that I had in the fridge and I didn't feel like opening up a new one. So between that and the cherry tomatoes, we'll have a pretty nice tomato flavored sauce that will go well with the mushrooms. Then when the cherry tomatoes have cooked off and are starting to burst, I'm going to add in about half of the lentils that I've cooked. The rest I'm going to keep in the fridge, and I can just incorporate those in another meal at another time throughout the week. Maybe adding it to salads or adding it to rice, just to add some protein, so it's a really nice thing to have cooked and ready for the rest of the week. And then I'm just gonna let everything heat up and combine, and this is almost like a vegetarian ragu. The lentils and mushrooms have kind of like a meatiness. They melt really nicely with the tomatoes and the tomato sauce. Once the polenta is fully cooked, I've tasted for seasoning and it definitely needs more salt and pepper, so I'm adding both of those and mixing those up. And then we are ready to serve our meal. So I'm just going to ladle a bit of that polenta onto a plate. I always like to do this on a plate rather than in a bowl. I just really like how it kind of like spreads across the plate, and you can see how it like slowly spreads, but at some point it also like holds its shape. It doesn't just run off the plate. It just has like a really nice thick porridgey texture. And then I'm gonna top that off with our mushroom, lentil, and tomato topping. And I did forget to add in butter to the polenta, which I would normally do when I was adding the salt and pepper. So I just topped off with a little bit of butter at the end to give it some richness. And to finish it all off, I'm topping off with some freshly grated Parmesan cheese. So that's the finished meal. The mushroom lentil topping definitely has a lot of flavor, so it pairs really nicely with the polenta, which is really nice and creamy. And I did have leftovers, both of the polenta and the topping, which I am going to repurpose into a different meal for the last meal in this video. So with my leftover polenta, I decided to make some polenta fries. And when you put away your polenta and it hardens up in the fridge, it just becomes this like nice, almost solid block. It becomes sliceable, and I thought that they would make for some really nice fries. These are inspired by polenta fries that I used to get at a restaurant I used to live near. So I'm just gonna take half of my polenta block and start slicing it up in 1/2-inch slices. And then from there, just cut them into some rectangle fry shapes. And my polenta was still just a little bit on the soft side, so I had to be a little bit gentle with it, but it definitely holds its shape and it's kind of like a gelatinous texture. So I've got my planks of polenta on a parchment lined baking sheet. I'm gonna drizzle on some neutral oil. You can also use like an oil spray if you have that to get everything more evenly coated. And then you can just sprinkle on with any kind of seasoning you want. You can just do salt and pepper, but I'm doing some Cajun seasoning here. And after I've sprinkled that on, I'm gonna gently turn over each of these polenta fries. And then I'm gonna do the same thing on the other side, give it another drizzle of oil and another sprinkle of seasoning. Again, I just made sure to be a little bit gentle with these polenta fries since they are a little bit softer and more delicate to handle, but they really weren't too bad to manage at all. And then I'm baking these in an oven at 425. I thought they would take 25 minutes, but they did take closer to 40 to 45 minutes to become fully crispy. Meanwhile, while that's baking, I am going to be making a garlic mayo to dip these polenta fries in. I'm starting off with a 1/2 cup of neutral oil. Then I have 1 whole garlic clove. I'm gonna crack in 1 egg, season with salt and pepper. Then I added a teaspoon of Dijon mustard and then about a tablespoon of fresh lemon juice. I always like to do this in a wide mouth mason jar because then I can stick my immersion blender directly into the jar and whiz up that mayo, and then I can just store it in the jar, so it's really easy. I don't really need to wash anything besides the immersion blender, and I just have to blend that up for a couple of minutes and the mayo is done. It's super easy. I love the addition of just that 1 garlic clove because it adds a lot of flavor to it, and then I can use this as a dip or as a spread for sandwiches, and it's a really great thing to have in the fridge. Then to finish off the meal, I just toasted off a couple of slices of bread for each of us, and then I topped it off with the lentil and mushroom mixture that I've heated up. And we're just gonna have that mixture over some toast. I'm gonna top it off with some scallions. So it's just like a nice different way to repurpose the different parts of the meal that we had the night before, and just to mix it up a little bit. This is how the polenta fries came out. They were really nice and crispy. I was originally going to shallow fry them, but baking them with just that little bit of oil really worked out well and was a lot easier. So I'm happy with the way those turned out. They were crispy on the outside, but really creamy on the inside. And since the polenta kind of has that like rougher cornmeal texture, I feel like you get a lot of crunchiness on the outside. So it's just a nice little different twist on fries. And the toasts were really good as well. In my opinion, you can really put a lot of things on bread, and I think it makes a perfect meal. So those are the 4 meals that I made this week inspired by the ingredients that I pulled out of my pantry. And I used everything that I wanted to use for the week, so I'm happy about that. I hope you enjoyed seeing some of these recipe ideas. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.